Ms. Ortenberger from SafeNest, please take the floor.
Thank you, and thanks for allowing us this opportunity to present today. So a little bit about SafeNest. We serve primarily Clark County, but over the pandemic, we've actually expanded services to serve a bit more statewide as needed. As you heard from the previous presenters, some of our rural agencies looked for some help and support. And I'm happy to say we expanded services during the pandemic out of need, but also out of an understanding that the space of domestic violence, in particular, given all the factors, was about to explode. And that is truly what happened. We've had days when our capacity has been 100% over what we're seeing in pre-pandemic levels, but our sustained issues have been about 20 to 30% above pre-pandemic levels. We work with 25,000 clients a year, delivering about 146,000 services. I have 89 full-time staff and 150 dedicated volunteers who work at least 3 shifts a month. And we operate in 11 to 65 locations, including Mesquite. We have an office and a shelter program in Mesquite. The large flux in locations there has to do with how many hotels and apartments we flow out into when our 100-bed main campus is fully booked. So interesting, in the previous presentations, you saw 211, I think, sex trafficking charges and 29,000 domestic violence charges in the last year we had data available. And here is why. You know, we like to think of domestic violence, sexual violence, and sex trafficking really sort of sitting in their own buckets. And unfortunately, that's how we work far too often. But the reality is these things are interlinked much more tightly than we give credence to an understanding. And that comes into the science and understanding of polyvictimization. And this is the body of work that has been developing nationally really over the past 15 years that talks about the fact that we want to stop the pipeline to homelessness, to domestic violence, to sex trafficking. We have to start looking at the victimization of children, which is a large indicator of what victimization and or abusive behavior could continue into the future. We see this web of polyvictimization in our clients every day as we've created a much more robust intake system to deal with the entirety of their trauma and not simply just the domestic violence in which they may have intersected with us first. So when we look at who's affected by domestic violence, we have survivors, and Serena did a great job of covering the stats, but here's a stat we don't talk about often enough. Women living at and below the poverty line are 5 times more likely to be victims of abuse, of domestic violence, than their non-impoverished peers. We talk about abusers. SafeNest runs an abuser batters intervention program. We work with 750 abusers each year. I will talk more about the deficits and how we work with abusers and how our court system is hamstrung to do more in that space. But here's a correlating stat we don't talk about enough. 70% of men who abuse also abuse alcohol. There is absolutely a correlation in that space. And we talk about children who are affected. 76% of children who grow up in a household where domestic violence is present will repeat that cycle as a victim or as a batterer. And we talk about society at whole and who's affected by domestic violence. And the fact of the matter is if you are involved in a mass shooting or a workplace shooting, that shooter is likely to have domestic violence in their record. In fact, highly likely to have domestic violence in our record. And the millions of dollars we spend in domestic violence as a country and as a community also has a societal impact. In fact, we did a presentation for the U.S. Embassy in Kazakhstan in October as part of a State Department collaboration that we're part of. The interesting thing about Kazakhstan, who is up here in the yellow part of your map above Russia, is that they have no standalone domestic violence law. They have no built-out court system for domestic violence. But yet you notice they're yellow. The United States is also yellow. We have the same percentages of domestic violence in a state where we're spending, in a country where we're spending $800 billion a year to combat something in a place where there is no standalone law. for domestic violence. So collectively, we're failing. We're failing survivors, abusers, children, and the people of Nevada. And I say the collective we because I include the domestic violence movement in that space. And when I say that, I will start out by talking about how we're failing in the abuser space. We, as a domestic violence movement, have focused on the symptoms of abuse. We've focused on the survivors. We've focused on their experience. But the fact of the matter is if we were cancer doctors, we would want to be understanding why the tumor got there and what created the tumor to begin with so that we could eradicate cancer, right? When Nixon made cancer a national priority, he didn't say just deal with the symptoms. But unfortunately, what we have done in domestic violence is said survivors, 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 and survivors are incredibly brave, incredibly important, and absolutely need resources. But in order to end domestic violence, we have got to work with the abusers, never excusing the behavior, but until we understand it and can explain it, we can't end it. This is a critical space, and let me show you what this looks like. This is a report, as I mentioned, SafeNest runs a batterers treatment program. This is a post report from one of the abusers who went through that program. The outlined squares are the pre-test, the dark squares are the black test. What you want to see in this evaluation is the levels going down. So in truthfulness, we saw a marginal improvement in this client's truthfulness. However, we saw a dramatic increase in their propensity to be violent, to use alcohol, to use drugs, and to have control issues. I know this information. My counselors know this information. The abuser who took the classes knows this information. The person who doesn't know this information is the judge. Because in Nevada, our statute is 26 or 52 weeks of treatment. I don't have a conversation. My counseling staff does not have a conversation with the judge. And even if we did, the judge would have no ability to change the sentencing for this abuser, even in the face of the fact that we're seeing they have a propensity to be more abusive. And in the report that we get from the program, it even tells us we have to be looking at what is going on with the violence scale with this participant. So incredibly frustrating as providers in the space that we can't have further conversations or do something different and more robust with our abuser population. The realities here are stark. So there are bright spots though. We are working with UNR on the batterers treatment program. One of the things that we should be worried about as a state is compliance with the state standards around who can deliver batterers treatment. We are the only provider in the state that does a pre and post and midpoint evaluation on our survivors, on our abusers. So that's an issue. So this study, the UNR study, should be incredibly helpful in helping us in that space. We're talking about batterers. This is a huge step forward, right? Because we can talk about survivors and the needs of survivors, and that is a very critical space, and we need to expand that infrastructure. But if we want to end this, curb the rates, bring this down, we have to be talking about batterers. There are states like Kansas that have adopted universal standards for batterers treatment. Then they can cohesively measure that across the state. That's having great results in Kansas. So we're watching that closely. Maine is also doing something similar. Solutions, you got to hold providers like myself accountable in this space. We need to agree on uniform data points and collection methods with this population. And we need flexible sentencing for judges so that we can have more of a dialogue. And also, you know, we saw 29,000 charges for domestic violence, right? In the initial presentations that happened today. My numbers of course, are very similar. Within that 29,000, there is segmentation of that abuser population. And we are treating that entire population the same. When we look at our survivor population, what is not working in that space? So Serena mentioned this, but the study, the only cohesive study on this is 50% of women say their root cause of homelessness is domestic violence. We want to turn off the pipeline to homelessness. We have to turn off the domestic violence, and we have to figure out additional supports. The systems we have built for support do not take into consideration polyvictimization. We cannot continue to look at things through this myopic lens of, are you DV? Are you sexual assault? Are you sex trafficking? We have to understand, interlinked with all of this, and the child abuse population that is intersecting with that, this work is cohesive. And until we have cohesive solutions, we're going to continue to churn in this space. The safety net for survivors differs greatly from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Serena mentioned that as well. So tonight, and this will answer some of Senator Marzola's questions. Tonight, all survivors will not find the bed they need in Clark County. I can't speak to the rest of the state cohesively. So SafeNest spends upwards of $30,000 a month on overflow hotel rooms. We use a lethality index, which is a 0 to 20 point scale of where is someone on that index to determine whether or not we have a bed for you. The need is so great, my lethality index is pegged at 16. 16, you have to have 16 out of 20 to get a bed with us tonight. This is ridiculous because the amount of support and investment it would take for a domestic violence survivor who had a score of 3 or a score of 4 to find a positive trajectory, and the trauma, less trauma that they will have intersected with can go down hugely if we have more beds, more confidential beds in non-communal living space. As a state, we have a hodgepodge of support numbers and places for a victim to call or to go to. This is an example of what's on the AG's website. And Nicole and I have had this conversation, so I know that she's aware. But imagine you just experienced abuse. You don't necessarily want to call the police, which is really common for our survivors. So you go to the Attorney General's website and you get this document, trying to figure out who to call, who to navigate, what to do. And then our protection orders are, denials are increasing in Clark County. Again, I can't speak to the whole state. But if you look at the domestic violence offenses, and this is from the FBI crime report, you could make the argument 2017 and 2019 are pretty level. 2018 was not a heroic year. Clark County did not put their data in the report that year. But what you can see here is 30,000 a year. And then this is our TPO protection orders being issued. This is not because fewer people are asking for protection orders. This is because denials are going up. And then if you see the smaller bar, what this is extended protection orders. This is when a victim can actually start to receive compensation for child support and things from the abuser. And those are also declining. And the denial rate on those is incredibly high. So when we look further, what does a survivor encounter when they call 911? I am constantly bombarded with the question of why didn't she leave? This is what the space looks like. These are the systems when a survivor has to navigate their domestic violence. And this is only a few of the systems. We have a working MOU with Nellis. You overlay the military in here. You overlay the other systems, sexual assault exams, all of that in here. This only gets more complicated. When we ask survivors, why don't they leave? And this is the space they're confronted with. Every one of these is a step. A lot of these include a step where you physically have to go somewhere on a bus, because most of our survivors do not have their own cars. How much of this can you withstand, often with kids in tow, before returning to a batterer looks like a better option? We do not have systems that support our survivors. So what are the bright spots? Homicides are down in Clark County for domestic violence last year. So rates of DV are up, but homicides are down. That's a win. We've gone from an average of 24 in the Las Vegas metro jurisdiction to 17. We have a large working partnership with Metro and have since 2017. Last year, we were on over 5,000 domestic violence 911 calls, linking survivors at the point in time of the abuse and the 911 call to services. 67% of the clients that we intersect in that space come into SafeNest for additional services. As Nicole mentioned during the AD's piece, we are involved in the effects of the high-risk teams and what that can do to further drive down domestic violence rates. But here's what we're seeing solutions nationwide. Survivor resource centers, both virtual and brick and mortar, to truly fix this space, the slide I showed you before of all the systems that a survivor needs to navigate, we need one statewide number to access services and support related to the space of domestic violence, sexual assault, and sex trafficking. That number needs to be answered 24/7, 365 with text and chat services. And the back end of it can be built out to still work with local providers, but we cannot let one call go unanswered. In addition to the UNR study, we have a UNLV study, which is finding out what survivors want from the justice system, because we're missing it. We have 95% recants, 95%. The justice system is not working in its current format for survivors. And there is promising research coming out around restorative justice models related to domestic violence. This makes everybody nervous. The research is coming out clearly in some places where they're truly studying this, but it is an option and something that we should be looking at as a state as well. And when we look at children, 76% of children will repeat the cycle of domestic violence. 1 in 7 children is affected by polyvictimization. Some studies say 1 in 3. Our kids are suffering. Hurt people, right? That's what we say when we work with abusers here at SafeNest. Much of the abuse within my own abuser population that we work with, they have history of child abuse. They have history of trauma. They are victims from childhood who are perpetrating that as abusers as adults. Children do not know what is not appropriate when they grow up with it. The Cupcake Girls, which is an agency we collaborate with who work with sex workers, 75% of their clients came out of foster care system. So if we want to find the hotbed of where we can turn this pipeline off, we have got to start to focus on foster care with our youth prevention programs in a holistic and complete way. And that has to be the entire family unit. We have a working partnership with CPS in that space. That has got to be a priority for us statewide. Youth who witness violence have the same brain activity as children who are being directly abused. So when we award custody in this state, at least in this county, because it's what I'm most familiar with, our judges are most often awarding joint custody, even with an abusive partner. When we think about this, children witnessing violence have the same brain activity as children who are directly receiving the abuse. We are doing a disservice to our kids and further creating that pipeline to repeat the cycle. And I said this, but kids don't know what's okay. So Christina Vella up at St. Jude's Ranch shared a story with me, a client that she had who is now aged out of foster care, who was trafficked by her uncle. He used to take her camping and had a tent and would just be inviting men into that tent all night long. And this was how she grew up. This was the monthly activity in that household. And she didn't like it. She didn't enjoy it. There was nothing about it that she wanted to be part of, but it was what she knew. And I think too often we think kids are going to raise their hand and say, I'm suffering at home. Things aren't good at home. I'm being made to do these things. Kids do not know what's not okay when they're growing up with it. So bright spots. I recently visited the Family Justice Center in Milwaukee. They received funding to completely retool their entrance models to be supportive for children coming into the domestic violence, sexual assault world, make it as comfortable and as welcoming as they were doing that for survivors. They're seeing some very positive indicators on that in terms of the children's data and support systems. Pathways to Hope, which is a program we run here in Southern Nevada with partner agencies where we take 100+ kids out of domestic violence households. We go up to camp for a week, and then we have year-round programming. A highlight of this program is the Raiders typically send us an alumni player to come up and meet with the kids up at camp in Utah. Two years ago, just before when we ran the program the year before the pandemic, we had Junior Iona, he seems to be 7 feet tall, and he's definitely a very wide individual as well. He's very large in stature. He came up and talked to the kids, and he took 20 of my 7- and 8-year-old boys fishing. And they stood in a creek fishing. They didn't ask Junior one question about football. They asked Junior how he didn't hit his kids when he got angry with them. What does he do when his wife gets mouthy? These are the questions our kids have. These are the questions we need to be able to answer. And programs like this give them real life role models who can help them navigate through what they're seeing in their own lives so that their future does not have to mirror what they are experiencing as young people. And the good news here is the data collection models exist for us to support youth. If we could do simple data collection points, and we plan to partner with communities and schools on this space, we can start to see which kids are most likely to repeat these cycles and begin to put different and more comprehensive supports in place. We need age-appropriate curriculum mandated in all Nevada schools. Serena spoke to this as well. I know Danielle from Signs of Hope does a great deal of work in this space. This needs to not be something we are fighting the school board on. This is not necessarily about sex education. This is about how we treat each other, and this is how kids should expect to be treated. We have a program coaching boys into men and athletes as leaders that we've focused on high school athletes. We know 95% of C-suite members were athletes as high school students. We are working with that population to do relationship curriculum. There is a little in there about consent, but it is much more about why it's inappropriate to say to a partner or a friend, hey, you throw like a girl. And on the girl side, the bullying and body shaming that happens in sports locker rooms is real. And we are helping young women navigate that space so that locker rooms can be healthy places. And we need to mobilize local role models so that our kids see themselves in success. You know, it is fantastic to talk about Maya Angelou. It is way better for us to be able to connect her fantastic story with a local person that kids can relate with. We see really positive signs in our data when our kids hear from local folks about struggles they had and how they are thriving today. And let's look at society. So we estimate the price tag, and this is out of the Texas Domestic Violence Cost Calculator. The price tag for Clark County all in is about $2.3 billion a year for domestic violence. Now, no one's writing a check, and I don't come up and ask the state for that money. If I did, we probably would have had this conversation before, right? This trickles in all these different buckets: lost productivity, expense for the police districts, the courts, and all of the expenses that go into this. But it is estimated through all of the different things that we do in 1 year for the cost of domestic violence to be about $2.3 billion. Mass shootings. Every mass shooting in the United States has a link to domestic violence. Even our 10-1 shooter, there are stories of him being abusive to his partner up in Mesquite. This is very, very prevalent. Most of it is much more clearly documented in their police reports, but it is there. Lost productivity at work is an issue for employers. We work with employers on this quite frequently on how to help survivors in their own workforce. And as Serena said, 1 in 3, 1 in 7, 1 in 3 women, 1 in 7 men, it can be 1 in 4 men if we're looking at a larger context of the definition, are suffering from domestic violence. And we're the 3rd most dangerous place in the country for women being murdered by men. Bright spots here: survivor resource centers around the country are providing places for survivors to get comprehensive resources. I want a bright spot for every person in Nevada to be that they live in Nevada and that we are innovative and we're pushing the needle in this space. We're doing new and creative things. Our partnership with Metro has gotten national and international attention because it's driving down the homicide rates, but it's connecting survivors with resources they need on the scene at the time that they need it. We need a community awareness campaign so that everybody who may be struggling or may have a friend or family member who's struggling knows where to go. And we need to hold ourselves responsible to the community by pushing out a report card. So possible next steps: use the ARPA funds, at least a portion of them. I won't ask for all of them, but a portion of them, to build one safe place, a model survivor resource center, and transformational housing to support the needs of survivors and children. We can break this cycle if we create the supports. And that takes a system that looks like this to a system that looks like this. This is what we want to do. This is the space we want to create. And again, that can be virtual and brick and mortar to support our entire state. We also need to look at the findings that come out of the batterers research and reimagine and pilot different treatment program models with judges being able to have some flexible sentencing. And I know that the DV subcommittee in Clark County, which we sit on, is interested in taking that up and doing legwork for this committee around that to propose some things for the next legislative session. But this is critical, and we have UNLV researchers on that team as well. We need to review the research from survivors and what they want from the justice system and propose solutions that match that need. And we need to investigate youth curriculum and delivery models and build out legislation that mandates this information is given to children. This can no longer be a community issue. This is a public health crisis. We need to mandate that. And we need one number, statewide. We can integrate the back end, we can roll out referrals, but every survivor deserves to pick up a phone or text or go on a chat and be answered in the immediate time that they are available. Sex trafficking victims, domestic violence, and sexual violence survivors have a window in which they are mentally and safety-wise able to reach out. We have to be ready to answer that call every single time. And we need to create a group, a subcommittee that reports to the governor. I am not sure of the constructs around that. I will leave that to this committee, but we need to create something that's consolidating the momentum, both from the child services world, which I heard the great stuff that Esther had to say today, and all of these different segments, and pull it together into comprehensive solutions, because when we've done that, we will be creating a safe space for our community at large. On behalf of everyone affected, especially the children, thank you for your time today.
And thank you for volunteering to head up, chair, organize, and run an entirely additional task force commission, and for everything that you do for victims and survivors, and for a really great presentation. I have some questions, but I'm going to go to my colleagues first. And before I forget, I do just want to mention that I love that you're thinking about possible next steps already and some possible legislation, and we are always happy to talk through that legislation here in the Interim Judiciary Committee. If you have something that you want us to think about, look at before our last meeting, or even become one of the committee BDRs. But I'm also sure there are plenty of people here who'd be happy to sponsor legislation for SafeNest. So let me go to members' questions. It looks like Vice Chair Wynn has her hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you for that. And thank you for all of your work, Liz. What your organization and what you guys do is just never ceases to amaze me. I have a couple of questions. I know that we've had conversations about kind of the lack of inclusion and addressing, and I know you guys have made huge steps to include like communities of color and our undocumented survivors out there. Are there any programs, or are there any things that you're doing to kind of incorporate some of those unique aspects that those individuals face in not wanting to report for immigration purposes, those kind of things?
Yes, so we have a couple of community awareness campaigns that are targeted specifically at that audience. And we actually did a report for the Huffington Post a couple of years ago, because they were asking, have we seen a downturn in our undocumented clients coming to want to disclose the SafeNest at the time when there were a lot of ICE riots and things going on, or ICE raids and things going on. And we did not see a downturn. And the great news around that is I have two incredible U visa and T visa advocates who are embedded in that space. So we actually hold office space at the Mexican consulate. And we constantly are reminding our survivors and our clients, we do not disclose, right? We do not share that information. So it's safe for them to come and work with us. So we've done a really good job at creating that. And then we embed ourselves with Immigrant Home Foundation and those types of organizations where the intersectionality of that undocumented status and violence, we're likely to come into more contact with survivors. So yeah, and I will tell you, one of the biggest things that we work on is trying to educate the family court judges in the TPO space when the survivor is undocumented and the abuser is documented, that it does not always mean, in fact, 99% of the time, it's not a manipulative factor to say that the abuser is not abused, right? The judges go to there's a bit of a bias that a survivor who's undocumented is saying there's DV because they're undocumented. So there's education throughout the system, but specifically for clients, we reach out. We always have Spanish speaking advocates in our space. And, you know, our client population matches pretty much the snapshot of the documentation. And then recently we just started working with RTC on our heat map of where we do most of where most of our clients are coming from, and how can we create some RTC safety corridors. So if someone's being abused and they're using rapid transit to escape, can we put emergency buttons at those rapid transit bus stops? Because unfortunately, that's a trend we're seeing, is people getting grabbed from the bus stop, because if you're escaping, you have no car, you're going to the bus, right? You're generally not using Uber because you don't have the resources for that. So all of that kind of work is happening in the space.
Do you know if you've had a lot of work where you've worked? I know you work with a lot of the batterers, like from a batterers treatment perspective, which I think is a more holistic approach that I appreciate. But do you know, I mean, you know, I know you're aware that if someone is convicted or charged with that charge, it causes them to be deported or be inadmissible for future like lawful entry. Do you work with different immigration groups to kind of like, I mean, it's just a very awkward space where you're protecting victims and also protecting families and trying to get batterers the treatment that they are looking at.
Yeah, so that's a lot of where our partnership with Immigrant Home Foundation comes into play, because they are more versed in that space. I will tell you what we see in that space is occasionally abusers will use that as a manipulative tactic, right? I'm going to call Metro on you and say that you're being abusive, and then the victim's arrested as the abuser, right? Because the signs of abuse and all of that can, you know, be staged. I have done so many ride-alongs with Metro. It is hard to know exactly what's happening on these scenes sometimes. So somebody's erroneously arrested. That then can become very problematic. And unfortunately, the way our Metro support, our Metro and police advocates work, is when there's an arrest charge for someone, even if the judge and everybody else recognizes that that's probably the victim, it really prohibits them getting that support from a system advocate. So it's really complicated. And yes, the possibility of deportation there exists. But there, you know, I will say there are so many huge pieces of the elephant of the system. Oh, that isn't one that we are overly engaged in from the batterer standpoint, other than our collaborations with both the consulate and the Immigrant Home Foundation folks.
I wasn't thinking it more of the stance of the batterers, just knowing that that was probably something that influenced people's reporting, you know, concerns, knowing that it would potentially break up their family like that. But
well,
just
to be real quick, that is a conversation that I constantly have with Nellis, and we'll be actually presenting at the larger Air Force Summit in Alabama in May, because the military has a very strict no tolerance policy. That no tolerance policy is in of itself a problem, right? Because if I need help around domestic violence, but my spouse is in military, and they're going to lose their job if I report, and that's my livelihood, I'm going to take it. I'm going to take the abuse, because I don't want to create a homeless situation for my family until that abuse gets so bad, right? So we have to look, and that's the conversation I've been having with the Air Force, is we have to look at what we're creating on the backside, because there is nothing that we have created from a systems approach that is a deterrent to domestic violence, right? There's no penalty that we've come up with. It's like, oh, great, I'm going to think about that before I punch you. That doesn't exist. So we have to start to understand this space from the perspective of actually what's happening and not what we don't want to happen.
And then, Chair, if you don't mind, I have one more question in a different space.
Yeah, go ahead.
You had mentioned something about TPOs and the denial of TPOs. Do you think that's like a more educational piece, like on the judicial end? Mm-hmm. I know that we passed some legislation to make it easier to file those TPOs. From the data that you've collected, and even anecdotally, do you see any solutions for where there can be improvement in that space?
Yes. So I just had this conversation with the AG's office yesterday. As we sit on that subcommittee around the court systems. Will be pretty clear that I believe that we are working with an overset of biases on behalf of the survivor, right? So, or sorry, on behalf of the abuser. So we seem to have a judges group right now in family court that is aligning itself with the idea that a survivor needs to prove their space more than what the legislation requires. So I don't know what the long-term fix is. That's what we are working with the AG subcommittee around. But here's what I do believe. We need open and clear reporting requirements from the court to know what the number of denials are and what is actually happening. We need transparency as a community, as a legislative body, as everybody, transparency into that, because without that, then we can't really know what's happening. Because we sit in about maybe 30 to 40%. And then we work with Barbara Buckley's team at Legal Aid. They sit in another percentage. We don't have a whole picture. And I do believe the courts are willing to provide that. It's just collaborating and bringing it all together. But I think let's look at the data and then see where the solutions might be.
Thank you. You answered my next question. It was just what kind of data do we have on those denials so we can track what the trends are.
No. And I have ETPO denial data, which is really rare, right? Emergency temporary protection orders, because we do those for Clark County and we've seen those increase. And it's places where we've never had an issue before getting ETPOs being able to be approved. So we work with the courts on it. We try to have conversations around it, but it is a difficult space right now.
And then finally, my last question is, as you had mentioned, like a common number, it seems like common sense, but obviously we don't have that. And I know it does take resources. Are you thinking like a universal number or like a 911 or a 411 or that kind of like space where it is the same, wherever you are? Yeah. So yes. So Boston, New York, a couple of Boston, sorry, that's not a state. Massachusetts, they maybe think they are. Massachusetts and New York and other places around the country have one clear number that you call if you're suffering in this sort of hidden violence space. And then the back end of that is it's very comprehensive, right? It doesn't really change, but what it allows, I sat in a Senate hearing last year during legislative session, and I think it was Senator Harris who asked, well, who do people call, right? And there was no cohesive answer in the room, but it should just be like, you call 702-718-HELP. We know that across the state, that's the number to call and get connected with resources so that every one of you, anybody that's doing media across the state, we can have one universal number. That's what I'm looking for. Here's what we know about 3-digit numbers. They're not trusted by undocumented. They're definitely not trusted in some of our higher crime communities. There's a belief that that's correlated with government, and folks, that there's an aversion to government interference. And I get that. I understand that 100%. So so there is a little bit of research in the number, but that's what we'd like to see. And SafeNest can host that with all of the supports to the back end. But I think that that's a solution. And that's also on the AG's office. And I have talked about that, but how can we make this work? So no survivor, if you're in White Pine, if you're in Tonopah, anywhere, there's a number comprehensively listed that you can call and get supports. What this would also do for the state is solve a massive data problem, because if we're funneling all that information into one number, even if the back end is filtering it out to different providers or different service channels, we can collect data. And that can then be comprehensively used to better understand what's happening statewide, both with a police response and a non-police response. Thank you, Liz. I will turn it back over to you to chair. I could talk to her forever, but we'll do that offline.
Thanks.
All right. It looks like Assemblywoman Summers Armstrong.
Thank you so much. This was a lot. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So every time I hear you speak, Liz, I just, it's a whole lot. So one of the things that you talked about was joint custody. and you talked about how our desire or our habit of joint custody could be detrimental to the children. There's a lot of talk about family unification and about fairness, but would you please speak to that? Because I think that maybe we don't have a clear understanding of what you are speaking to.
Absolutely. So let me preface all of that by saying what we need on the front end in both the person who's using violence and in the survivor space is better screening mechanisms. We have got to understand, right? If we've got 30,000 people using violence every year, such that there are charges brought, there is segmentation within that work that needs to be done. We need to be looking at whether this was the first charge, what's the level of the battery, what's the lethality assessment say, and we need to look at that jointly. That body of information then needs to be used in consideration as to whether or not we are doing a joint custody situation. Because what's happening too often is we're just doing joint custody. I have a case, we had a case in December. The child's arm had actually been pulled out of the socket by the abuser. They are separated, right? But joint custody was issued. We've got to start to help our judges. And I feel for our judges and I feel for the folks that are working in this space because there is so much volume. So let's create screening mechanisms to say, hey, if we're seeing these things, then this approach is in this basket of approaches would be better. If we're seeing these things, then let's look over here, but let's help our judges navigate this space with the appropriate screening tactics so that we actually know what kind of environment we're putting kids into. And then to piggyback on that idea, you know, I am a firm believer that people can evolve and change in their space. And so we have to then, if we do one screening mechanism, we have to be looking at screening mechanisms throughout so that as somebody participates in a program, that then is an opportunity to regain custody, right? Or regain the ability to see your kids. None of this can be like, oh, it happened and we're done. We have to understand that people within the mental health space, within the batterers understanding space, have the ability to transform, and then we need to honor that growth. But we need to make sure that the kids are in environments that are primarily safe before we just order the joint custody.
Thank you. Madam Chair, if I can ask a follow-up. One of the slides that you had, you said that this is an assessment that it was an assessment that you had done, and it showed the violence. I don't know if I can get to it on my other screen really quick. That you all had done an assessment of someone who was of a batterer, and you had these little black boxes that were filled in.
Yes.
At the beginning, it was at one level, but then at the end, it was even higher.
Yeah.
Can you please speak to that? Because that has blown my mind and I don't understand what I just saw there.
Yeah, no, I know that should terrify all of us, right? So first of all, let me say that's an outlier. So we pulled a batch of research from over 2 years to provide to UNR as we started in this batterer study space. That comes out of the 2 years. Of the 2 years of folks that I had in batterers intervention programming, we had 8 outliers. So those are folks whose scores actually increased when they should have decreased, right? So my point with all of that is, so when I look more in depth and I read the case notes and I understand the complexities of this individual, because this is individualized work, we want to always have the macro look, but we need to have the micro look as well. It looks to me through the case notes, this individual developed a drug and alcohol habit while they were in treatment with us. That's not, there is a lot of, as I mentioned, 70% of men who abuse also abuse alcohol. That's a stat. So it's not uncommon for people to use alcohol and drugs as a coping mechanism. But then his response to it was to become more violent and desire to have more control. The idea, though, is like, look, first of all, we got to be studying this way larger than just SafeNest. Everybody should be doing this work. But then what that should have triggered, right, in a perfect world would have been me working with Judge De La Garza or Judge Graham at Justice Court and saying, hey, I'm seeing some worrying signs in this individual. can we issue some substance abuse programming and then come back and do a DVI in 3 months? What can we have? What more supportive solutions can we put in this space? And I am not a legal expert, and I know there are probably tons of things in there that like, oh, we can do this, we can't do that. But that's the kind of societal approach to helping someone navigate out of abuse, right? It is absolutely possible for an abuser to stop abusing. They need to take responsibility. They need to understand the traits. They need to understand their triggers, and then they need to make the choice, right? It is a choice. We have to provide that pathway. And if we see somebody struggling in that pathway, our answer cannot be more incarceration, more fines, and more of X. It needs to be, what are they struggling with? How can we get them in programs that can help them? Because that is going to make society safer, and most likely, a lot of my cases, most of them have kiddos involved. It's going to make the family unit better, whether or not mom and dad or husband, mom and dad are together or not. It will make for a better environment. So that's kind of what I'm looking for in that space.
Okay, last thing. This correlation that you highlighted between women's ability to be able to be self-sufficient,
yeah,
and their dependency upon an abuser and whether or not they stay, unbelievable. I was a military wife, and I can tell you stories, and I'm sure you've heard them before. And it seemed, and at the time, I didn't realize that this is a pattern that happens in civilian life as well. As a military spouse, you often are overseas or in a place that you don't know. You're depending on this person to sustain the family, and they get away with all kinds of stuff. As a military member, those who have a propensity for abuse, and the spouse is just stuck, right? So now if we're seeing this in civilian life, then I think we have to be honest about the types of career paths that we're putting women in, the types of job opportunities and training and education opportunities that are being offered, and whether or not we are actually not giving women enough space to be independent so that they don't fall victim. And maybe that's oversimplification, but I can only tell you one thing. My mother, Deborah Lee Coleman Harris, said to me, if you can type, you can eat. And that was the way that I was able to remove myself from a situation that could have been really, really bad. I was able to sustain myself. And so it makes me concerned when other women don't have that opportunity, that they're going to get stuck. And then we have this cycle of the children seeing, ending up in this whole cycle again and again. And so if you could speak to our education link, that would be wonderful.
Yes. So here's what we know, right? So University of Oklahoma has got a ton of research on the HOPE scale and the scientific versions of HOPE. So we've got to build the HOPE score in our kids, particularly our kids that are in homes, and our survivors and our batterers. And all of this, the data exists, the research exists, the mechanisms to measure exist. But linked to HOPE is goal attainment. So we have to make sure that our young people see pathways out of poverty. We don't talk about poverty much in the domestic violence space, which is a disservice to our survivors, because oftentimes poverty is the second abuser. It is the thing that is holding them back and not giving them access and making those choices tough. I will be honest and say early pregnancy is an indicator and a concern, right? If we can solve some of these little pieces, but you're 100% right. That access to financial freedom, not only in the United States, but globally, is linked to women having a larger voice and not having to sustain violence. In fact, when we take women out of domestic violence situations, provide them with opportunities to increase their skill set, they become financially independent, even when they reunite with the batterer, which happens because let's not forget, this is usually a commitment made in love. When they reunite with that batterer, the battery stops because she has choices. She has access to a different set of things. And guess what? The batterer gets that. And so their relationship becomes different, right? So there is a whole lot of real important stuff that can happen in that space. Most importantly, we have got to link young people, both women and men, we have got to link them with clear career paths and financial opportunities, because abusers also abuse more often when there is financial insecurity, right? It makes sense. If women in poverty are struggling, men in poverty are perpetrating, right? Financial insecurity is a huge stress and trigger and point for domestic violence.
Thank you so much for your work and for the information. Candor, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Likewise, thank you. Other questions for Ms. Ortenberger? I am not seeing any more questions, so yes. Thank you again. I have one question, and it goes back to kind of the beginning of your presentation, talking about the dearth of services in the state of Nevada, which we all know about, and it's alarming. And I was just really struck by your description of not having enough beds for people who are trying to leave violent situations and using that lethality index. And I'm just wondering, I mean, this group that you're talking about, are we already limited to the people who are interested in staying somewhere else? Or does this also include people who are maybe not ready to leave yet, not wanting to leave? Because, I mean, kind of what I'm getting at is, you know, if a first responder, a prosecutor, somebody encounters someone who is in a dangerous situation and they don't want to leave, it sounds like you're saying that we also can't guarantee them that they can leave. So even if I can convince my friend that like what she really needs to do is leave this situation, there might not be a bed for her even if I get her to agree.
Yeah, so let me explain a couple of things. So we work with a group of folks that have taken, we call it our preferred provider network training. This includes churches and other nonprofits in spaces working particularly with different populations, like Gender Justice, who works with gender non-binary folks. They are all trained on the lethality assessment. So they can actually call the hotline and say, hey, what lethality are we at today? So if they're encountering someone or working with someone, they can do all of that on the front end. People do not need to call me or SafeNest all the time. If you disclose to someone at your church, it's usually the pastor's wife. If you disclose to the pastor's wife, that lot of that community has taken our training. They can connect directly with services. Not only that, they can continue to come onto our confidential campus to provide advocacy and support as long as the survivor says, yes, please continue to work with me. So there's that context. It is a difficult space, right? When we have to turn somebody away whose lethality score is a 12. Now, let me say two things in there. If there is any assault in the last week with a deadly weapon, so a gun generally is what we're looking for, or strangulation in the last month, you automatically have a bed. So that puts you at the top of the lethality scale because of what we know about strangulation and firearms. But yeah, if you're at a 14, one of the things we get is a lot of people who come here thinking they're going to get $100,000 a year, job at the casino right off the bat. They're very stressed out. They're abusers, maybe in Tennessee. That's not necessarily a bed with us because the chance of you being abused again, he's in Tennessee or she's in Tennessee and you're here. But what we do is connect people with other agencies. We work closely with all of the other providers in town. So to speak to there was one of the officers spoke about not having a place for youth at 3 a.m. When I talk about this family justice center space, this one safe place, that's designed to answer that question. So to answer your question, Chair Scheibel, we need to expand that bed count so that everybody has a bed. Now, it may be a triage situation where you're going to be with us for 3 days and we're going to get you to the right place with help and support, or we're going to get you connected. But we've got to fill that gap, which you're identifying really well, is I'm in abuse, I'm ready to exit, I need a bed, because we don't know when that opportunity to exit is going to come again. So we've got to build out that infrastructure. And I will be really clear, we have got to build it out in private rooms. We cannot continue to believe that communal living is in any way an answer. When children hear footsteps on a floor, they're triggered. 70% of women in their abuse are pulled out of showers. You've got to have a private shower, a quiet hallway, and we have to let people start to heal. Otherwise, we are just part of the continued trauma cycle. So yeah, you're 100% right. There's a gap there. We're trying to fill it as best we can. I have 100 beds in my main campus. I can expand out, and we often do that at $30,000 a month. But let's, while I love that I can expand, I can be very clear that my hotel and apartments are not getting the same comprehensive supports that my in-shelter clients are getting. Let's fix that. And then we can create a model that we can study, create a model that's appropriate for the size in Washoe, and build the virtual infrastructure out for the state.
Oh, that's really helpful. Thank you. Any other questions? Not seeing any.